Has the war that has been going on in Sudan for the last 9 months ended? Well, instead of a ceasefire, things have taken a sharp turn now. The two generals, with their loyalists, are fighting for absolute power over Sudan, while peacemakers are trying to negotiate and end the war. Just recently, we heard that a ceasefire was finally put into place, only to collapse. It appears that both the generals are near breaking points, but neither of them wants to surrender first. So, what has happened now that has changed the Sudan war forever? What has happened until now? And where are things going? Let's find out. So, what really happened in Sudan? In April 2023, a conflict began in Sudan involving the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, commanded by Hemeti, both factions within the Sudanese government. These are the two generals who initiated the conflict that was to convert into a war. This showdown mainly revolved around Khartoum, the capital city, and the Darfur region. It was reported that the RSF sparked the conflict by attacking government sites and launching airstrikes, artillery, and gunfire across Sudan. Khartoum and Omdurman turned into battle zones, prompting al-Burhan to move the government to Port Sudan, while RSF forces took control of most government buildings in Khartoum. This led to a prolonged stalemate, accompanied by the involvement of rebel groups formerly at odds with Sudan's government. By mid-November, the Mini Minawi and Mustafa Tambur factions of the Sudan Liberation Movement officially sided with the SF and the Justice and Equality Movement, GEM. On the other hand, the Tamazuj movement joined forces with the RSF and the Abdelaziz al-Hilu faction of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. North targeted SAF positions in the southern part of the country. Starting from October, momentum shifted in favor of the RSF. They defeated army forces in Darfur and made gains in Khartoum State, Kordofan, and Gezira State. The core of the conflict, a power struggle, remained intact. Despite being allies, both groups had jointly seized power in a 2021 coup. However, tensions flared over the proposed integration of the RSF into the military, leading to uncertainties about who would assume control and act as the military's commander-in-chief during the integration period. Therefore, the key figures in this power struggle are Army General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, his deputy, and RSF leader General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, commonly known as Hemeti. In October 2021, al-Burhan and Hemeti orchestrated a coup, disrupting a delicate transition to civilian rule, initiated after the 2019 removal of long-term ruler Omar al-Bashir. Al-Burhan, a career soldier from northern Sudan, assumed the top position as the de facto ruler of Sudan after the coup. At the same time, Hemeti, from Darfur's camel-herding Arab Rizagat people, became his second in command. As plans for a new transition unfolded, Hemeti aligned himself more closely with civilian parties from a coalition, the Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC, which shared power with the military between al-Bashir's overthrow and the 2021 coup. Diplomats and analysts observed that this was part of Hemeti's strategy to transform into a statesman and solidify his position at the center of power. Both the FFC and Hemeti, who amassed wealth through gold mining and other ventures, stressed the importance of sidelining al-Bashir loyalists. But how strong are the fighting generals and their groups? Established in 2013, the RSF has its roots in the Janjaweed militias, which were accused of war crimes in the Darfur region. Back in the 2000s, during the Darfur conflict, the government enlisted them to help the army quell a rebellion. Then, in 2017, a law was passed that officially recognized the RSF as its own independent security force. Even though Sudan's army has top-notch resources, boasting air power and an estimated 300,000 soldiers, the RSF grew into a formidable force of about 100,000 in recent years. They were spread across the country and have become deeply entrenched in neighborhoods throughout the capital since the conflict began. But why did war erupt in the first place? The unrest in Sudan can be traced back to a clumsy transition. When the war erupted on April 15th, the international media initially painted it as a standard power struggle between two generals who were once comrades. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the commander-in-chief of the Sudan Armed Forces, SAF, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, the commander of the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF. However, this narrative is far from accurate. To understand what happened, we have to go back a bit. In 2019, an uprising triggered by the worsening economic situation ousted President Omar al-Bashir, concluding his 3-decade-long rule. Sudan had witnessed uprisings in 1964 and 1985 that toppled military regimes. In 2019, the Sudanese people expected a brief political transition, focusing on economic issues with international aid and preparing for multi-party elections within a year or two. However, that wasn't the case. Two pivotal factors, absent in 1964 and 1985, came into play this time. First, owing to the Islamist nature of al-Bashir's regime, regional and international players were more concerned about dismantling it to prevent Islamists from returning to power. This led to a project to reshape the country, including dissolving the former ruling NCP and pursuing its leaders outside the bounds of the law. The comprehensive overhaul also included controversial issues such as Sudan joining the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, organizing pride parades before decriminalizing homosexuality and normalizing relations with Israel by joining the Abraham Accords. These matters were imposed on the transition schedule, even though they fall under the purview of an elected parliament. Second, naive neoliberals, primarily former communists and Baathists, were called by the international community as the legitimate successors of al-Bashir. Once settled in their positions, they disregarded the country's economic woes and failed to devise a reform program. Additionally, they displayed no interest in holding elections, given the narrowness of their support base. Before long, they clashed for power, each striving for a more significant share in this unusually prolonged transition. In reality, the entire transition turned into an effort to position neoliberals as the newfound political elite of the country. When the Constitutional Charter of August 2019 sealed a practical alliance between the military components, both SAF and RSF, and the neoliberals fell apart in October 2021, the international community imposed another deal on the two sides. This was the Framework Agreement of December 2022. Ultimately, Hemeti, already under pressure and fearing international sanctions for a violent crackdown on a sit-in in Khartoum in June 2019, aligned himself with the neoliberals to improve his political fortunes. Supposedly, he was also on a mission to restore democracy and civilian rule. By then, diplomats in Khartoum were aware that an eventual clash between SAF and RSF was unavoidable. However, no one was willing to call for an end to the faltering transition and the initiation of elections. When CNN asked the RSF spokesperson on April 26 about their objective, he stated that the group was seeking to capture al-Burhan and bring him to justice for many treasonous acts against the Sudanese people. Because the RSF initially fought at the beginning of the war to support the neoliberals, specifically to rid the country of Islamists, international think tanks like the International Crisis Group, ICG, have not hesitated to express support. While RSF initially needed the neoliberals to win international legitimacy, talk of restoring civilian rule prominently featured in its rhetoric. However, as the war scales tipped in favor of SAF, RSF found itself in greater need of a source of fighters to join the war, and the neoliberals were of little help in this regard. As a result, RSF spokespersons started to claim that their goal was to end the 1956 state controlled by riverine communities of central and northern Sudan and replace it with one controlled by Junaid tribes, the ethnic groups of Arab origin residing in the Kordofan and Darfur regions of Sudan, as well as Chad and Niger. The involvement of fighters from these tribes, whether Sudanese or non-Sudanese, is now a prominent feature of this war. This has significant implications for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Sudan, as well as for the peace and security of the region. As Rosalind Marsden, the former UK ambassador to Sudan and associate fellow at Chatham House, has cautioned that there is a risk of a de facto partition in which Hemeti controls Darfur and much of Khartoum, SAF controls much of the rest of the country, especially the east and the north, and an armed movement led by Abdel Aziz al-Hilu contests South Kordofan and southern Blue Nile. Indeed, in an audio recording released on September 14th, Hemedti suggests for the first time that if Burhan establishes a government in Port Sudan, he will form a government in Khartoum. Yet, this dimension is not taken seriously enough by the international community. It was announced that SAF and RSF had resumed talks in Jeddah, hoping to agree on a ceasefire and possibly a deal to end the war. With SAF gaining the upper hand on the main battlefield and RSF losing military momentum, the RSF is expected to sue for peace. This is particularly so because the meandering lines of tribal fighters from Western Sudan to Khartoum started to dwindle. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It is not true that the Sudan War is a fight between two generals, nor is it a war that was decades in the making. To be precise, this is a war that was triggered by a derailed political transition. The parties who caused that to happen still do not see the need for the country to pivot to the path of its transition. For them, a return to the transition implies the vanquishing of RSF and, even worse, the return of Islamists. But what about the peace talks? In July 2023, Sudanese paramilitary leader General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo affirmed his commitment to a ceasefire to bring an end to the devastating war in his country. However, the conflict persists, and there has been no headway in proposed peace talks between Dagalo and Sudan military chief. Meeting with Dagalo, Ramaphosa expressed hope for an imminent face-to-face dialogue between Dagalo and Burhan, and urged for an immediate ceasefire. But despite talks of a ceasefire, the conflict has intensified. Last month, UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths reported that over 500,000 people were forced to flee their homes in Jazeera province, previously considered a safe haven until the RSF attacked and captured its capital, Wad Madani. The RSF's takeover raised concerns among Wad Madani residents about potential atrocities similar to those in Khartoum and the Darfur region. The U.S. State Department has accused both the RSF and the Sudanese military of committing war crimes or crimes against humanity during the 9-month conflict. Griffiths, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, mentioned that horrific abuses reported in Wad Madani resembled those in other conflict zones. With nearly 25 million people in Sudan requiring humanitarian assistance in 2024, Griffiths emphasized that escalating hostilities were impeding aid efforts. He urged the international community, especially those with influence over the involved parties, to take decisive and immediate action to halt the fighting. However, the Sudanese military has declined negotiations with a rival paramilitary force, demanding their surrender, as the two factions continue to clash in central Khartoum and other parts of the country. This stance puts at risk international efforts to broker an extended ceasefire. Despite the truce's inability to halt the fighting, some areas of Khartoum experienced temporary calm, prompting many residents, especially women and children, to take advantage and leave their homes. The military's declaration that it would only consider the surrender of its rival, the Rapid Support Forces, indicates an increased risk of intensified violence. The breakdown of the ceasefire highlights the inability of the United States, the UN, the European Union, and regional powers to persuade Sudan's top generals to cease their campaigns for control. Both Army Chief General Abdel Fattah Burhan and RSF Commander General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo appear determined to achieve an outright military victory. Therefore, recent discussions between conflicting parties in Sudan have failed to make progress towards a ceasefire, as reported by Saudi Arabia, the host of the talks. The official Saudi press agency conveyed the facilitators' regret over the inability of the parties to agree on a ceasefire in the first round, emphasizing the absence of an acceptable military solution to the conflict. Previous talks held in Jeddah during the initial weeks of the war led to the Jeddah Declaration, committing to safeguard civilians and civilian infrastructure and permit essential aid. However, within a week, UN Aid Chief Martin Griffiths reported multiple violations of the agreement, including significant and egregious ones. and agreed. The United States, actively involved in facilitating the Jeddah talks, tempered expectations for the current round, emphasizing it was premature to discuss a lasting political solution. While the potential for working on achieving ceasefires was mentioned, the outcomes fell short of a comprehensive political agreement. Both sides agreed to collaborate with the UN to address obstacles hindering the delivery of relief aid and identify contact points to facilitate the transit of aid workers. They also agreed on confidence-building measures, including detaining prison escapees. This likely refers to prominent figures under former leader Omar al-Bashir, who sided with the army after breaking out of detention facilities early in the conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently cautioned the RSF against an imminent large-scale attack on North Darfur's capital, expressing concerns about the RSF's takeover of army bases in major cities, which raised fears of regional dominance. Meanwhile, a massive fire at an RSF-controlled oil refinery north of Khartoum, initially attributed to an army airstrike by the RSF, was countered by the army, stating it resulted from the explosion of a fuel tanker belonging to the militia. But what has happened recently? As of the start of 2024, Sudan's Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, has signaled its willingness for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire through discussions with the Sudanese army. The RSF, in collaboration with the Taqadum Civilian Coalition, has endorsed a declaration known as the Addis Ababa Declaration, extending an invitation to the army to join in the same commitment. That's what experts had predicted at the start of the war. Despite having soldiers on his side, it was hard for the RSF leader to continue the war, given that he was leading a rapid security force that had limited resources compared to the country's military. This was inevitable. However, this has cost the nation a lot. The 9-month conflict in Sudan, leading to the world's largest displacement crisis, has inflicted substantial damage on the country's infrastructure, and concerns about famine have escalated. Despite efforts led by the United States and Saudi Arabia to address the conflict through negotiations, significant progress has yet to be achieved, with previous agreements aimed at safeguarding civilians being disregarded. By backing the Addis Ababa Declaration, intended as a basis for further discussions and a political resolution, the RSF has demonstrated its strongest commitment to date to bringing an end to the ongoing war. RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti, has expressed a readiness to sign a similar document proposed by the army, emphasizing commitments to repatriate displaced individuals, establish safe passages, and involve civilians in peace talks. However, with Sudan's army gaining dominance, uncertainties persist regarding the extent to which Burhan would move toward peace. As for the RSF leader, he has apologized for violations and pledged to address rogue actors within the RSF. Despite the RSF publicizing the return of police and markets in some controlled areas, reports from residents and human rights monitors indicate instances of soldiers occupying and looting homes, as well as detaining and, at times, harming civilians. The army, engaged in extensive airstrikes, has also faced accusations of war crimes by Washington, which it denies. Because the RSF seemed weaker, the army chief decided to strong-arm it. On Friday, Sudan's army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, declared his commitment to persist in the 9-month war against the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, rejecting the latest peace initiatives. Earlier in the week, RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo had agreed to a ceasefire proposed by civilian groups, contingent on the military's agreement. However, skepticism arose among observers due to the paramilitary force's history of unfulfilled promises. The U.S. has accused both the Army and RSF of war crimes, with additional charges against the RSF for crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. Burhan, who also serves as Sudan's head of state, addressed troops in Port Sudan, stating, "The whole world witnessed these rebel forces committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in West Darfur and the rest of Sudan. For that reason, we have no reconciliation with them. We have no agreement with them. Since the war's initiation on April 15th, extensive regions of Sudan have been devastated. Sudanese politicians who met Dagalo in Ethiopia, accusing him of humiliating and killing the Sudanese people. In response to growing popular resistance against the RSF in northern Sudan, Burhan announced plans to arm Sudanese people willing to fight the RSF, urging them to join the military. That's the biggest of the developments. instead of welcoming the peace prospect, Burhan has decided to go all in into the war, arming the citizens. This has sparked a major controversy, spreading the idea that Burhan is trying to make public a party to the ongoing war. Earlier, it was expected that the RSF leader would be the one to talk about peace. Following that, the military leader would accept peace. However, as of now, seeing the RSF weaker and losing support, the military leader wants to push the RSF into the corner. In other words, he wants the RSF leader to surrender, accept defeat, and face consequences instead of dealing with him as an equal. This makes the future of the Sudan war uncertain. Unfortunately, chances are that the RSF leader will back off from the peaceful position, and the war will continue. However, if the international actors use their influence, peace can be achieved, led by assistance to the war-torn Sudan. What do you think? How can countries encourage peace between the two fighting generals in Sudan? Do you believe any of them should be given legitimate power, or they both should be removed and a civilian government must be put in office? In the comments section right below, let us know your thoughts on what the future of this war could be. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.